For those of you just tuning in, I'm Beth, and I basically am reading my dad's manuscripts. Right now, I'm reading a manuscript called Stonecaller. It's a fantasy manuscript, and tonight I'm on chapter 3. So, without further ado, I'm going to launch right in. Chapter 3. Consciousness returned, and with it, pain. He was lying on something soft, not like the pallets they laid wounded slingers on. Something was wrong with that thought. No, the wounded knee was some time ago. This had been, what? You're awake. We were afraid we'd lost you. A face was leaning over him. A weathered face, neat, gray-tinged beard, short hair, also gray-tinged. No one he knew. What was happening? Quedrin managed to produce some sounds, then forced out a word. What? The face smiled. Don't remember? No surprise. You took some knocks on the head. What happened was that an archer took a shot at the Carmista and hit her. Not straight on, but close enough to be scary. You used her sling and picked off the archer, who was just readying another arrow. Good shot, by the way. There were some in the back of the crowd who saw the sling in your hand and took you for the assassin. Wardesh Garden Guide. The real attacker was on the roof, so in plain view, but you had a weapon in your hand, so you must be the attacker. Head shook in disbelief. People can do the stupidest things, especially people in crowds. Anyhow, a lot of them took after you. But I came along too. And between me and two of my lads, we managed to get through to you and beat them off. You took a bit of damage, though. Remember some, Quedrin mumbled. Yes, the healers will be happy. They said in cases like this, the person often didn't remember anything. Do you remember saving the Carmista? Talking was getting a bit easier. Remember that, he managed. He wasn't going to go into any stupidity about it not being any of his affair. Not to this fellow. And you were rewarded for it with a beating, almost death. I apologize for the people. They love the lady. They worry for her. They know the political situation we're in, so in the same place where someone shot at the Carmista, someone sees a weapon in a foreigner's hands, the results are predictable, though perhaps not forgivable. Accept apology. And stop nattering about it before I say something like, I knew it was a bad notion at the time. This reminded him that, as things stood, he wasn't likely to be able to put that many words together. He felt the corners of his mouth twitch. The man leaning over him paused and took a deep breath. Looked over his shoulder. I promised the healer not to overtax you, and I promised to tell the Carmista when you were awake. She wants to talk to you. Right. Words would come, but making sentences was still difficult. She'll be here to see you in a while. The man looked over his shoulder again. Yes, I'm going. I had to at least give her thanks, didn't I? Yes, I know, nothing counts but what you can grind up into powder and make into a medicine. Quedrin, to the extent it was possible, followed the broad back out the door. His neck was stiff as a board, and his head ached foully. So they were grateful were they? A man might make something out of that. Be careful not to ask you too much, or you might... When he woke again, a woman was bent over him. Yes, that engraver deserved Yes, that engraver deserved a whipping. The nose is a little large, but not that bad. She smiled at him. They say I shouldn't trouble you too much. And Gwathornan had already passed on my thanks, but I wish to do so in person. They say you're young enough you shouldn't have any trouble healing. You'll be my guest until then, and at that time I'll give you a more tangible expression of my thanks. He was still having trouble getting words out. For true and for sure, he knew the kind of thing he ought to say. No reward is necessary, or some such nonsense. He already knew that how much would give a poor impression, possibly even decrease the reward. Being a friend of the Carmista could have its benefits, if a man used it right. I did what I could, he finally managed. Words were still a little troublesome. Yes, and a fine reward you had for it. I hope we can make it up to you in these troubled times. This brought to mind the fact that being a friend of the Carmista might be an unpleasantly short career. She leaned down and kissed his forehead. Get well soon, friend. Wardash knows I need all of my friends at this time. And she was gone. Quedrum began to improve, then began to improve rapidly. The healer, a wiry little man with great strength of both will and body, got him out of bed by force, if need be. Don't want to be coming down with the lung fever, do you? The sooner you're up and around, the less the risk. No, Quedrum didn't want to come down with the lung fever, nor did he want to lie around. He just wanted to see what might come of this friend of the Carmista business. A bag of silver at the least, he reckoned. Maybe even some sort of official recognition, which he might build up into something more. I can talk to the Carmista face to face. You have a problem, tell me. I'll take it right to the Carmista. That was a bit bald, but he could dress it up to look right and fancy. Make a bit of silver before people found out he couldn't do much for them, as they could by going to the hillside and shouting their trouble to the wind. That wasn't the right thing to do at this time. Where'd that thought come from? The right thing to do, anytime, anywhere, was what profited you, yourself. You're starting to get sentimental. You end up starving. One day a servant, wearing the better quality clothing worn by the higher nobility servants, appeared beside Quedrum, along with a healer. He's healthy enough to leave here? Yes, and we can use his place. All he needs is to exercise a bit, not let his strength fall off. It irked Quedrum to be discussed as though he were a horse at the market, but restrained himself. Wait to see what kind of a reward he was going to get. The servant was a cheery sort, well fed, though not fat, but clearly on his way to becoming one of those chubby, bustling, fussy sort. He had an oval-shaped face, the usual Gaffrodi dark hair, and a nose that looked as though it had been a model for those coins. It dominated his face and made him look slightly foolish. He seemed to act a bit foolish as well. So, Quedrum of Arndal, said as though Arndal was a city instead of a vague geographical area. Are you ready to go? Quedrum shrugged. I didn't have much when I came here, so I haven't got any gear to pack up, and some kind soul has seen to the washing of my clothing, so I'm reasonably presentable. The servant looked him up and down. Presentable in some quarters, but not, I think, for the Carmista. We will see to that. Please follow me. He gestured down the hallway with long-fingered hands. You may call me Fallish. That superior attitude tempted Quedrum to trip him as they walked down the marble halls. But friends of the Carmista did not brawl with servants in the hallways. The chamber Fallish led him to what seemed small in comparison to the common rooms of the inns where Quedrum had been used to sleep. It contained only one bed, so he suspected he had the whole chamber to himself. A set of clothing, Gaffrodi cut, was lying across the bed. If you please, sir, the clothing is a gift from the Carmista. When you are dressed, I will take you out to her. Which is as close to hustle your butt as a servant wants to come when addressing a friend of the Carmista. Quedrum was becoming very pleased with this new status. Fallish hovered while Quedrum dressed, seeming always on the point of reaching out and squaring something away. The trousers were loose, dark brown, and tied at the waist. The tunic was dark blue, lacing up the front. The boots were dark leather and gentle on the feet. Fallish grimaced when Quedram insisted on fastening on, albeit under his clothing and out of sight, both his old talisman against lameness and the ribbon Shabakalish had given him. The servant looked him up and down, twitched his tunic into a invisibly better line, brushed off a speck Quedram couldn't see, and nodded. Yes, that's fine. Please come along then. He led Quedram along another set of hallways, and turned him over to another servant who stood waiting at a doorway. No words of introduction were spoken, but the second servant clearly knew who he was expecting. He bowed slightly to Quedram. Please accompany me. The servant opened the door. They entered. The Carmista was sitting at the far end of the room on a chair placed on a raised stone dais. When I present you to the lady, you will know. Quedram nodded. Already he was being irked, but he held himself in check with the knowledge that a little restraint now would allow him to make more sure of the situation later. He noted that style and fashions of the Carmista's court favored plain clothing cut plainly. To that, however, each person seemed to add their own little touches, bright sashes, jewelry, and so on. A Carmista requires certain courtesies, though not at all like the great kings people told tales of, whose Thogar peacemaker had swept away. Those rulers who required the highest nobles come into their presence kneeling and bowing their heads to the floor until the great king might summon them to look up. Here, it was enough to bow deeply from the waist, and not to stare at the Carmista's face. Just to be getting away with something, Quedram bowed a quarter bow, winced, and stood again. I regret, Highness, that I cannot yet bow properly. And if it reminds you of what I deserve, so much the better, he thought to himself. She gave a little laugh. Thank you. A Carmista does not rate the title Highness. Lady will do very well here. For an instant he had the urge to say something, anything, just to hear that laugh once more. But he managed to suppress that silliness. He knew better than to speak again unless she asked him directly to speak. You saved my life, Quedram. For that reason, I felt it necessary to reward you fittingly. First, there is this. She held out a small leather bag, the size of one of Quedram's fists. Come, take this directly from my hand. He did so. From its feel and weight, it was over 100 silver coins. This is an immediate reward. I also desire to give you something which is perhaps more valuable. Take this and read it. It was a small rolled scroll. Opening it, Quedram found it was written in the common language, though with a few little changes in verb forms and wordings. He'd learned his letters, more or less, from the hedge wizard Freylock, but this was hard going for him. The Carmista, likely assuming he couldn't read it at all, said, It is a deed of gift to you, for a piece of land, 1 plough day in size, for your use, inalienable and indivisible. What does that inalienable and whatever mean? It came out sounding more brusque than he had intended. She laughed again. Inalienable and indivisible. It means the property cannot be sold, given away, nor divided up in order to sell or give away part of it. It is to protect you from swindlers and cheats. It is land enough to start you as a small farmer. Thank you very much, lady. A piece of land he couldn't sell was no great gift in his mind, but at least there was money. Proper courtesy in this instance was still the best notion. You didn't complain in front of the Carmista. Besides, she'd start laughing again. Shut up, you fool. Are you turning all sentimental now? She was speaking again. Further, you are invited to accept my hospitality for the next while. When you are well enough, you will ride out to view your new land. He bowed again, and his wince was not altogether affected. Thank you, lady. Nonsense! I am the grateful one here. Now my servant shall find a seat for you over by the wall. After all, you've just gotten out of a hospital bed. With a touch to his arm, the servant led him away. By some magic, or more likely by some clever anticipation on the servant's part, there was a stool there. So Quedrim sat listening to the court's business. This lord's complaint meeting, that a lord's defense, and so on, had little meaning to him. So he spent most of his time making schemes to use his bag of silver as seed to build up even more. The main trouble was that making a fortune from the sort he commonly hung out with could be a long process. A copper here and a silver there was all he could count on. What he needed was some young lord with a lot of silver and a fair deal of gullibility. Of course, that would have to be someone with enough respect for Quedrim the hero to overcome the notion of speaking with Quedrim the street scum. So he had a little time yet as lady's guest to Quedrim. Gwathernun was standing over him, almost looming. There seemed to be a touch of menace to the noble. Sir? He looked up, predicting bafflement. Morcar or eat me if I jump to my feet for you. It's my duty to look out for the Carmista, and as such, I go digging around to look into the character and motivations of those who, for one reason or another, find themselves close to her. He held up a hand to signal Quedrim to silence. I agree. It is scarcely likely anyone would go to the trouble to have you merely get close to her. The fact that you saved her life is not lessened no matter who you might be. Still, I have my duty to do, and I find that Quedrim from Arndal has been in this town for only a short while, during which time he has appeared to have been strangely fortunate at betting. That he makes strange claims, bets on them, and wins. This does not show intent or even a bent toward treason, but that sort of person might well stir up trouble in her court now, at a time when we most need unity. I do not intend to let that happen. Sir? Quedrim put on his best bewildered look. Doing that was going to annoy Gwathorun, but better than defy him or outright deny any bad intent. Gwathorun, however, nodded, as if hearing what he expected. I didn't expect any more of you, and I can't toss you out while you're still her hero. But I can keep an eye on you, and if you put a foot too far wrong, I'll get rid of you one way or another, and trust my credit with the lady is high enough to get me through. So you might play a game here or play a game there, but make sure you don't stir up things too much. Gwathernun turned and walked away. Quedrim's immediate reaction was to go seeking, as soon as possible, some careless young lord to cheat. What saved him from doing anything rash was partly his own good sense, and partly the fact he couldn't go roaming around until the lady had dismissed court. Long before he had quieted himself and determined that he'd arranged things so he was rich and gone before Gwathernun was aware of it. When the court was dismissed, Fallish, the servant who had seen to his dressing, met Quedrim outside the doors. It was thought you might appreciate a guide back to your chamber, sir. It is also thought that you might prefer a rest before dinner. I'm to dine with the Carmista? That startled him. Well, yes, sir. Not at the highest table, of course, but she would have you share meals with her while you were her guest. Well, then, if you were to be sharing meals with her in the whole court, he'd be able to look for a likely prospect among the lords. Carefully, though. Wardesh knew who Gore thought Gwathernun's spies and sources of information might be. It would be a shame to be tossed out without having given the least chance to get a little more ahead in funds, with his lovely bag for seed and all. He was glad for Fallish's presence. He didn't think he'd be able to find the chamber on his own. The chamber was way back in the corner, near to, but separate from, Palace servants' quarters. He might be a hero, savior of the Carmista, but he could imagine the fuss and fury that would come of trying to put Quedrim, a man of no family, up among the lords and fancy folk. Back in his chamber, he noticed all his old garments, including his sling and pouch of stones, were gone. My things! What's happened to my things? Your, garments, sir? The short pause made it sound more like your pox-ridden rags. They were disposed of, sir. I see. It occurred to him that he didn't need the clothing, not with what he was wearing. He wasn't going to let the servant have it all his way, though. But I need the sling and stones. They're important to me. There was no change in Falish's expression. I will see to it, sir. Indeed, when he came to lead Quedrum to dinner, he presented the battered pouch and sling. Thank you, he said on a sudden whim. There was a flicker of expression on the man's face. My duty, sir. As the servant had indicated, Quedrum was not at the highest table. He could, though, see the carmista if he leaned his head just so and looked. He didn't do that very often. He didn't want to seem like a yokel. He did hear a laugh from time to time, though. He knew from rumors that the nobility had special manners to be used at the table. He watched his neighbors doing as they did, and thought he managed things not too badly. He found himself wishing he were seated nearer to the carmista, and when he found himself wishing that, he scowled and took a hold of himself. Old woman's apron! You're like a boy with his first crush on a neighbor's daughter. You don't belong here, and you'd know it. Just find an opportunity, make some money, and be gone. He glanced around the table, assessing his table mates as possible quarry. He warned himself to be careful. No sense messing things up by being in too big a rush. At one point, he saw Gwathernan's eyes on him from further up the table. It almost seemed to him Gwathernnan was reading his thoughts, hearing his unspoken plans. He shivered and started talking inconsequentialities. With his neighbors. He'd learned over the years to take an interest in what people around him thought, though it taxed him to act as if a particular fashion of embroidering for men's sleeves was a matter of great importance. The servant Falish was outside to guide him back, though he was quite sure he would have managed it this time. He hadn't even had that much to drink. Somewhere in the middle of the night, a sound wakened him. A strong hand gripped his, and he was on a sandy plain with bright moon shining overhead. Shapakalish stood over him, with his mule standing in the background. I apologize, oh heroic slinger. I wish to speak to you, and it seemed better to do so not in the palace where someone might well be listening. So instead you dropped me out here in the cold? What do you want? I see you've already met the carmista. She's not precisely a princess, but close enough. Princess? What does that have to do? Oh, my so-called reward. Yes, I've been trying to work out a way to bring the two of you together, but you managed it on your own. Suppose, said Quedrum sarcastically, suppose I take the least bit of nonsense in earnest. Surely even you know there's a war coming on, and a war the carmista is not likely to win or even survive. Oh, pessimistic slinger. You'll just have to make sure that she does win and survive. More cur-eaten nonsense. I'm one man, with a few tricks, a sling, and a bad leg. What do you think I can do? The best you can, of course. And if I had all the answers to give you, then what? Why, then you'd do nothing for yourself and never learn a thing. But I think it's time we went back. It's not too likely, but you might be missed if you stay away too long. There seemed to be a certain tension around the palace the next day. Falish professed to know nothing about it. For himself, Quedrum felt the servant considered Quedrum to be slightly beneath him, for Falish did as little as he could for him without risking trouble, and whatever he did do, he did with flourishes that seemed to say, "See how superior I am to you, who came off the streets in only a day or so ago." Quedram understood that his own status as a hero had its limits. He might demand a servant be whipped, but if there are no words spoken, he could only point to a certain manner, and it would only seem that Quedram himself were putting on airs. So he had to put up with the petty slights a crafty servant could get away with in certain situations. Let the servants be. More money was likely to be found among the lords, and in particular, the younger ones, who had not yet learned to be careful of what bets they laid, and with whom. Some lords were willing to grant him at least a little acceptance on the grounds that he had saved the Carmista. Others felt that he had only done his duty to the Carmista, and that the mere fact did not warrant his being allowed to rub shoulders with his betters. One of the younger lords, more appreciative of Quedram's deed, was willing to talk to him. The day has come. For the past months we've all been madly collecting troops, but today was the last day of diplomatic maneuvering has come to an end. Tomorrow, or the next day at the latest, we'll be going to war. He said it with all the cheery insolence of one who's never seen war. Quedram was tempted to pull up his trouser leg and show what war had done for him. That, of course, would make the young fellow think less of him, and Quedram needed to be accepted, at least for now. "Sir," he said, opting for a polite but minor honorific, "I'm a foreigner, and newly arrived. I know little of the local situation. Would you mind telling me what's happening?" "Of course. It's but loss of Dara, of course. Everyone knows his reputation, how he fancies himself something of a magician, even to the point of using his own folk to test his spells. So, when he wants to join our land with his, we, Gifrati, must resist. And now, with the rule of the kingdom of Devlash up in the air, our lady is more vulnerable. Our army is about equal of Dara's in size and ability, but they say Batlas has some kind of magic troops at his disposal. So we of Higfrod must find ourselves pressed." "He uses magic?" A safe comment, and one which would likely elicit further information. So it proved. Indeed, he uses magic, but the word is not that all his spells are always fully effective, and that sometimes they have effects other than those intended. One thing he's had some success at, he's used his magic to sink deeper and more extensive mine shafts. That has made him rich. On the other hand, there was the endeavor with the sheep. He produced sheep that were bigger than normal, near the size of a small cow. They gave him more fleece and more meat for each animal. On the other hand, those sheep required more grazing, and in some places grazed the hills down to the grass roots. In the spring, many of those hills without the grass to hold them were eroded away. His next move was to take over more land, much of which he ruined in the same way. He finds it hard to admit a mistake, Batlas does. He wouldn't have the animals rounded up and killed. Instead, or so the story goes, he introduced a sickness among them by magical means, killing them thus, and making it seem like something beyond his control, and not at the end of a magical effort gone wrong. But the strange thing is that this disease seemed to only cause minor illness among the normal sheep. A very interesting coincidence? To give the man his due, he did use his magic to recover the hills he had ruined, but at the cost of 5 years where no cultivation or grazing was allowed. 5 years when the hillsides produced nothing. They say the 5 years were up last spring, but only a few cultivated plots had been allowed, and no grazing. There is another story he tried several times to conjure a dragon, but has never managed to do so. Rumor has it that all he's been able to produce is several large deformed lizards which did not survive. So, given that, when we hear he's magicked up some fighters, we wonder just what sort of fighters they may be, and whether or not there might be some hidden problem with them. I see. So no one worries much about the war then? Oh no, I did not say that at all. It's just we don't have too much concern over his magic. Oh, I see. The real surprise came next morning, with a sharp and penetrating rap at his chamber door. Since he didn't raid a personal servant, only Fallish, when a servant's assistance was necessary, he opened the door. Gwathrenan was there, scale armor and all, a pair of soldiers with him. Gwathrenan was looking grimly cheerful. Good morning, Quedrum. The army is marching, with the Carmista at its head. At this time, her money is better spent supporting fighting men, not a crippled adventurer out for any copper he can get. Yes, the money she's given you is yours. I wouldn't presume to take that. You deserve it for what you did. Now please, come with us. It was quite clear that the two soldiers, Gwathrenan's men, would only be too happy to lay hands on him and march him along like a felon. Resistance would only lead to indignity. As he gathered his few possessions, he asked, "Why do you assume I can't be of any assistance?" Assistance? Ha! What would you do? Get Batless in one of your games and cheat him out of his land and title? Come along. So, shortly, Quedrum found himself looking at a closed and barred palace door. He scowled and shrugged. Who needs it? I have a tidy bit of money, and that means a lot of seed to make a nice game or two. A walk through the market showed that few people were about, and of those, even fewer would sort to get into any sort of game with. He stopped and bought an apple from a fruit seller's stall, and commented to the woman, a short, round, and rosy, like one of her own apples. There don't seem to be any people about. She laughed a little bitterly. It's the war. The young men with little sense have gone off to be soldiers. Then the recruiters came through and hauled off most of what were left. Then a good few decided to go off following the army to see what bits and leavings they might find on the trail of the soldiery. She spat on the ground. The sort that robs corpses after a fight. He raised his eyebrows. Oh my, he said. They've all left? Without me? I'll have to hurry. The woman looked at him sourly. Wars and battles are nothing to make fun over. I had a son once, taken off by the recruiters to be a spearman in the army. I only heard much later from someone who had served alongside of him that he died. And now? She clamped her jaw tight. It was plain to Quedrum she just had another grandson, maybe more, gone off in this latest army, and is waiting for the bad news again. He decided in short order that his own best interests lay in the army's wake, too. There were few enough in town for games, and many of those were being very cagey with their money. If the war went badly, if there was a siege, they'd need all they had. There were still a few who were willing to take the risk in hope of winning a bit more, but it was plain it would be hard scraping just to stay even. It would be hard scraping just to stay even. There was another thing to say for just being out with the army. He wouldn't be cooped up in the city if it came to a siege. In fact, if things went that bad, he might just wander over to Batless. With the new silver mines that young fellow had talked about, there might well be a few pieces of it not being carefully looked after. Even the old sling dodge might make him a fair bit of money. He spent some money with care, because he knew full well that the markets were full of people willing to take his money for shoddy goods. He bought a blanket, a pack sack for a bit of food and the like, and a hooded rain cape. Thus equipped, he went out on the trail. He planned to stay among the camp followers. The old Gwathrenan might not like seeing him there if he happened to notice. But the likelihood was he'd just shrug and figure he'd been right about Quedrum. Quedrum would make the occasional affrays among soldiers, just often enough to find who might or might not be willing to bet on a little trial of deftness, stacking the stones and the like. Of course, the greatest soldiers had a little money. Still, a copper or silver here or there would be all the good. There were always some who were sure they couldn't be outdone. Certainly, certain they knew every trick going. They're the ones one could make money off of. Those were the ones one could make money off. You just had to make sure you didn't go to the well too often. Soldiers tended to be a tough lot, and it was hardly likely any officer was going to make any sort of trouble over a gambler bilking the troops who happened to get a couple of spears rammed through him. He didn't bother rushing out of town. The army had marched out this morning, moving at a usual army pace, the speed of the slowest man. Well, perhaps not the absolute slowest. Anyone too badly lamed would be left behind to make their own way. Quite often, squads of tough troopers would scour the path behind the army, picking up stragglers and keeping them moving. There was no likelihood of a battle being fought in the first day or so, and a lamed man just might be in condition to fight in a day or so. This meant the army didn't travel very fast. He might not catch up to them today, but he would likely do so tomorrow. For all that, the camp followers would be a shapeless mass following in the army's wake, with no one among them to keep any sort of order. Their only set goal would be to have themselves set up for a parade by the time the troops had finished setting up camp for the night. He'd come up with the first of that lot sooner or later, with no urgent need on him, for once, to get there and make money. He set to fiddling with his stones as he went. He was still working out the kinds of things he could do with them, and it seemed Shopakalish was right. The more he practiced, the easier it became to move them. He had one bouncing on his hand as he walked. Then, just to see what would happen, he tossed it up and said, "Go ahead." It continued to float along ahead, at about the same distance, no matter whether he hurried or slowed. He was watching it so carefully he missed an uneven spot in the trail, stumbled, and nearly fell. When he rose, the stone was still there, floating at the same distance in front of him. He brushed off his knee and muttered, "Too much of a distraction." He looked at the stone. "Suppose you go at arm's length to my right." The stone obeyed. Quedrum started walking again. "Old woman's apron! I mean, I could go halfway honest with something like this." "Come see Quedrum the Magnificent. Watch him make stones dance." By the late afternoon, he had 5 of the special stones drifting along in a flock beside him. He made them travel in various formations. A line, a V-shape like a flock of geese, 2 lines, a pair of columns, and whatever shape he could imagine. He reached into his pouch again, and the stone he took out was not one of his special stones. Well, what about that? Hadn't the little fellow said after a bit he'd be able to handle any stone? He took it up and ordered it into position. It went, although a little grudgingly, if such a term could be applied to an inanimate stone. It was not possible to describe it exactly, but it seemed to require a little more effort to make that stone go and stay where he wanted it. He settled for having the 6 of them moving around, keeping up with him, dipping, swooping, changing directions according to his demand. However, long before he came up with the first, or last, stragglers of the camp followers, he had brought them all safe into his pouch. He wasn't entirely sure what he might do with the stones, but there's no point in spoiling the surprise. He wondered idly about how the Carmista was dealing with this business. The picture came clear to his mind. The proud-nosed face, lined with cares, a laugh that, "Stop that, Quedrum! The likes of you don't go chasing after the likes of her. Trying to pull that sort of thing, and all you'll get is stomped like a bug. You're out to make some money in just the place Quethurnan doesn't want you to be." Even by Quedrum's broad standards, the crowd that followed the army were a bad lot. For most of them, the major reason for following the army was to rob the slain on the battlefield. As often as not, they weren't too picky about who was considered slain. Quite often, they themselves made certain the body they were robbing was actually dead. Some of them also sold things that a soldier on the march could use. Most of the women of them, even all, were prostitutes. The soldier, for whom any day might be his last, might be well willing to pay for a night's companionship. and a man who had survived a battle might well want to celebrate his survival. Whatever his feelings might be for the crowd in which he found himself, Quedram kept those feelings to himself. No sense at all in riling people he was going to be making a living off of. He did a little, to start with. His clothing, fine as it was, would have made him stand out. But on the way, he done a little scuffing and staining with grease, which left it looking a little something more like an upper servant might have discarded. The cloak he'd bought before leaving town helped. The best he could ever say for it was that it was of uneven quality. When it wrapped around him, it served to hide his clothing. For all these safeguards, he got suspicious looks here and there. This sort of people distrusted anyone, and everyone, particularly the unfamiliar. Some were just less careful than others about letting it show. For his own part, Quedram kept to himself. People like these didn't ask personal questions any more than they welcomed questions about themselves. He still had his own food, but just to keep from being stigmatized as a total outsider, he paid 2 copper coins for a share in an astonishingly good stew. He sat with the others, took a small part in the conversation, even told a few jokes to prove he had a sense of humor. There wasn't a lot of conversation, which was just fine with him. He could well afford to take his time, wait until he was accepted in the sense that the camp followers accepted anyone. He could use the time to smell out who had a bit of money here or there, and who might be parted from it. He found a place to sleep off from the rest, and slept wearily, something he was used to. By the next evening he had become familiar, though was still not familiar enough for personal questions or answers. That time may never come. Though by no means a forced march, the trek had its own rigors. The trail was dry, and the camp followers forever breathed the dust as the army cast up. As they wound along between and sometimes over hills, they could sometimes see along the millipede which was the army. Many feet stomping along, the wink of sun on weapons, armor, and accoutrements. As much as the countryside as Quedram ever saw in the haze was the gray, dusty road winding, twisting, turning, crossing rivers. He was careful not to do too much with his special stones, just balancing 1 or 2 of them on his hand, something that seemed like a nervous habit. On occasion, he would cause a pebble beside the road to roll over, being careful to be at a sufficient distance that no one could suspect he was doing it. As time went on, he became sufficiently accepted for some of the camp followers to gamble with him. He played honestly, rolling the dwarves' bones, winning a bit, losing a bit. There still wasn't a lot of silver among the camp followers, and no one was betting high enough to matter. As for Quedram, he'd save his tricky stuff for a time when he could actually make something out of it. He listened to all the rumors, granting little credence to any he couldn't somehow test for himself. Depending on who he believed, they were anywhere from 4 days to 4 weeks from meeting the enemy. People swore their cousin's best friend had spent the night with the Quathranan, and told her it was so and so many days, and they were the ones that put the least stock in. So it came as a bit of shock one day when they heard that the enemy was in sight. There was a rumor, at first. Then there was a sudden stir and flurry among the army, which said that this was more than a mere rumor. A force of Gafrati cavalry herded the camp followers into one bunch. The most telling evidence of any of the camp followers who might have been a spy waiting for the proper opportunity to slip over to Batlas to let him know just who and what composed Carmista's army. This close watch would last until the battle was about to be joined. Then the cavalry, or most of them, would return to their places in line. No one on foot was likely to be able to rush over, bypassing the line of battle, and get to Batlas in time to have any effect on the fight. The thing to do, of course, was to wait until the bulk of the cavalry had gone, and then manage to slip out and get as close to the line as possible. One would thus be ready, when the battle was over, to get out and look among the dead for anything of value. Of course, one did not want to get too close. If it happened to be one's own troops that got driven off the field, one might run over in the crush and further, and enemy soldiers with their blood up would make little or no distinction between soldiers or civilians. In fact, any civilians they met would likely get skewered, because soldiers would likely recognize what the civilians had been there for, and look upon them with even less respect than the crows and vultures who would gather afterward. Quedrum managed to work his way near the edge of the herded camp followers. He didn't do anything further at once, and even when all but 10 of the troopers had been called back to the lines, he held his place. Someone way off to the right made a sudden dash, and a trooper was after him in an instant. The sudden squeal told everyone the fool hadn't made it. Someone had to be the first. Quedrum had only been determined it shouldn't be him, nor was he the second. After the second rush started, there were too many for the troopers to stop. Not that it mattered, but it was too late for any spy to change the outcome of the battle. Quedrum went with the rush, avoiding places where the troopers already were, or making for. Might be good sense to see what the Graffordi are up against, he thought. And, if necessary, get myself well out of the way. At last he found himself a place under some kind of berry bush on a hillside, where no one seemed to notice him. He was on the army's extreme left flank. Up the shoulder of that hill were a force of cavalry in careful lines, probably cavalry reserved from what he could recall hearing about battles. At the top, just hidden from him, was probably more where the Carmista was, and most likely where Guathrin was as well. Would she really lead her cavalry into battle, or would she leave that to Guathrin? In the front were the cavalry, mostly light infantry, in places he could see, shield and spear, axe, sword, or dagger. The phalanx was probably to his right, hidden by the hill. Now the army were advancing. Slingers had taken their places, flinging stones at the enemy. His leg twinged suddenly, then settled down. He could sense the enemy as well, out there in the distance. On his flank, what would be the right flank of the Dori army, was a force of light infantry. They looked strange, and even stranger when they came near enough for him to make out any features. They had dark blue skin, lumpy-looking bodies, and wore only breechcloth. On their forearms they only carried a sword, no shield. Off to his left, slingers and archers, flank refused, protected these men from an enveloping attack. Further over, he could now see a part of the Dori phalanx coming at their steady pace. Lines dressed as though with a rod, spikes presented. What was it about those blue-black horse swordsmen in front? Having only a sword and shield made them light troops, but they seemed to have more cohesion than light troops. More like light infantry, like the phalanx without spikes or shields. They seemed to have suffered not at all from the slings and arrows of the covering troops. Even stranger, they advanced silently. No battle cries of any sort. Now the battle was joined, with the ring of steel and the sounds of men shouting and screaming. The blue fellows seemed immune to weapons. A straight blow bounced off of them. A grazed blow scratched their hide, leaving a grayish streak, but no wound. Here and there, one of them went down. Those who fell did not seem to suffer wounds as a man might, but rather broke to fragments like a pottery jar. Why were some smashed when others seemed to not suffer at all? The light infantry in front of Quedrum were not up to this sort of task. The blue warriors showed no great expertise with their weapons. But then they did not need to be. They were constantly hewing, shrugging off return blows, and still chopping. No matter how poor their swordsmanship was, one of their blows is sure to strike home in the long run. Their blows struck home more often as the men in front of them began to panic and lose their own timing. It seemed no surprise to Quadrum when the Gifradi in front of him broke and fled, leaving the blue-black men, still near 500 strong, advancing through the gap. Then, wheeling in a maneuver that would have done credit to the phalanx, they attacked Gifradi's flank. Quidrum, though no expert in tactics, knew that if Gwathranan didn't act fast, this could be the beginning of the end of the battle. The commander's reaction was quick enough. A large portion of the cavalry reserve went thundering down toward the enemy. Come on, come on! Quadrum's oft-stated notion of this war having nothing to do with him seemed to have gotten lost. Fists clenched, he saw the cavalry clash with the blue-black men. More of them shattered before the force of the cavalry charge. But whatever they had for their minds, the ability to panic was apparently not included. They turned and wielded their swords in a seemingly clumsy fashion, ignoring defense, going all out on the attack. They held the cavalry, who were bogged down in the melee. The clash with the unyielding infantry having cost them their impetus, they were left to stab and hack and try to force their way through. Quadrum lost track for a moment of what was happening, dropping and lying close to his bush while the disordered Gaffardi light infantry went pouring by on each side. When he looked again, the Dori cavalry reserve, or a good part of it, were dashing across the rear of their own lines, most likely to wheel round into the gap of the Gaffardi light infantry and left. When the remainder of the Gaffardi cavalry reserve went galloping down to the hill, Quadrum saw the Carmista was indeed in front. If the army cavalry were going to attempt to hit the infantry flank, the last of the Gaffardi cavalry were going to try to take the Dori cavalry in their flank. Quadrum could see in front of the ranks of the enemy a cavalryman, indistinguishable by better quality armor, also highly decorated, who seemed to be their leader. Hardly thinking, Quadrum pointed at a rock peeking out of the soil. Up, he said, pointing at it, shedding bits of dirt and strands of grass. Lifted it into the air. He pointed it down at the enemy cavalry. Go and knock that fellow out of his saddle. The rock flew fast, almost as fast as it had been thrown in a sling. If one could imagine such a thing as using a head-sized rock in a sling. Despite that speed, Quadrum saw that it hit the man, catching him full in the chest. The Dori officer flung up his hands, falling back out of his saddle. Quadrum felt a sudden weariness, as though he had carried the stone down a hill and slammed it into the man's chest. His vision closed in, and he felt himself fall. Okay, and that is the end of that for tonight. So, everybody take it easy, and I will talk to you again tomorrow night when I bring to you another chapter.